You have never missed a payment in your life. You have a job, a mortgage, maybe a car loan, a credit card with a manageable balance. By every measure, you are a responsible adult navigating the financial system correctly. And that is exactly how it was designed to work. Because here is what most people never stop to consider. Every mortgage payment you make, every student loan installment, every minimum credit card balance you roll forward, none of that is a system breaking down. That is the system working perfectly. For someone else, modern economies do not run on money. They run on debt. And the difference between those two things is not semantic. It is the difference between owning your future and quietly renting it from someone who will never introduce themselves. This is the story of how that happened, how debt became the invisible architecture of everyday life, and why most people will spend decades servicing a trap they never saw being built. The system nobody explained. Start with a question most people cannot answer. Where does money actually come from? The honest answer is unsettling. Most money in circulation was not printed by a government. It was not minted from gold. It was not transferred from some vault somewhere. It was created the moment someone signed a loan agreement. When a bank approves your mortgage, it does not reach into a reserve of existing cash and hand it to you. It types a number into a ledger. That number did not exist 10 minutes earlier. Your debt created it. And then you spend the next 30 years working to pay back money that was conjured into existence specifically to be lent to you. This is not a conspiracy theory. It is basic central banking. The Bank of England published a paper in 2014 explaining it plainly. Commercial banks create money through lending, not government printing presses, not gold reserves. Lending. The implications are staggering once you sit with them. Every dollar of debt someone carries is simultaneously someone else's asset. Debt is not a side effect of the financial system. It is the raw material it runs on. And if debt ever stopped growing, the system would not stabilize. It would contract. Economies built on credit expansion require that expansion to continue. The moment borrowing slows significantly, spending slows. Companies contract. Jobs disappear. Which is why governments and central banks spend enormous energy trying to keep the debt engine turning. You were never told this in school. You were told to save money, avoid debt, and live within your means. And those are not bad ideas individually, but they are individual advice for a systemic reality. The economy you operate inside is not built for collective thrift. It is built for collective borrowing. How the trap gets personal. Now bring it down to ground level, because the macro picture only matters when you understand what it looks like inside someone's actual life. Take a reasonably typical financial trajectory. You graduate with student loan debt. Interest begins accruing before your first paycheck arrives. You need a car to get to work, another loan. You rent for years while saving for a down payment, watching housing prices rise faster than you can save. When you finally buy, you borrow 25 times your annual salary and agree to pay it back over 3 decades. At which point, for most people, a substantial portion of every paycheck is already spoken for before they decide to spend it on anything. None of this is reckless. None of it is financially irresponsible by the standards of the world you were handed. But the cumulative effect is that somewhere between the ages of 25 and 45, most people's income is less a resource they control and more a pipe running from their employer directly to a set of creditors, with what's left trickling into daily life. And here is the mechanism that keeps the trap elegant. It is not the debt itself. It is the interest. A 30-year mortgage at a historically moderate interest rate means you pay roughly double the original loan amount by the time you're done. On a $400,000 home, you might pay close to $800,000 total. The bank's profit on that transaction is not a fee for a service. It is a claim on decades of your future labor. Credit cards are even more precise. The minimum payment structure was not designed to help you pay down debt. It was designed to maximize the length of time you carry it. Pay only the minimum on a significant balance and you can spend years, sometimes decades, making payments that barely dent the principal. Meanwhile, the interest compounds quietly, efficiently, exactly as it was engineered to. This is not predatory in any illegal sense. It is Sigh, the psychology built into the architecture. The financial system did not just build debt into its structure, it built debt into culture. At some point in the 20th century, consumer credit stopped being a last resort and became a lifestyle expectation. Advertising sold the idea that you should have things now and pay for them later. Credit companies sold convenience, banks sold aspiration, and collectively, a generation came of age believing that carrying debt was simply the normal friction of adult life. Think about what that shift actually meant. Before accessible consumer credit, you could only spend money you already had. That created a natural constraint on consumption. With credit, that constraint effectively disappeared. Spending could exceed earning indefinitely, as long as lenders remained willing. That willingness did not come from generosity. It came from the understanding that a borrower locked into monthly payments is a reliable income stream. The longer someone carries debt, the more valuable they are as a customer. Loyalty programs, rewards points, 0% introductory rates, all of these exist to build habits, not to save you money. The business model depends on you staying in the system. There is also something more subtle at work. Debt changes how you think about risk. When your financial life has obligations attached to it, the consequences of uncertainty are higher. Losing your job when you have no debt is uncomfortable. Losing your job when you have a mortgage, a car payment, and revolving credit card balances is terrifying. That fear makes people more compliant employees, more risk-averse investors, less likely to make unconventional choices with their careers or their money. A person with no debt and 6 months of savings can walk away from a bad situation. A person with 5 years of obligations cannot. Financial dependency and behavioral dependency turn out to be related. The national scale zoom out further, and the picture becomes harder to ignore. Total household debt in the United States crossed $20 trillion in recent years. That is not national debt. That is personal debt. Mortgages, student loans, auto loans, credit cards, medical debt, $20 trillion of individual obligation sitting inside tens of millions of households. Each one a separate quiet pressure. Student loan debt alone has crossed the $1.5 trillion mark. An entire generation entered the workforce already in deficit. Before they bought a home, before they had children, before they started investing for retirement, they were already behind the line. And here is the uncomfortable logic of that arrangement. Student debt is particularly difficult to discharge. Unlike other forms of consumer debt, it follows you through bankruptcy in most cases. It is, in structural terms, one of the most binding financial obligations a person can take on, and it is taken on at 18 or 20. 2, often by people who have no realistic framework for understanding what $200 a month for 30 years actually means in the full context of a financial life. Now stack that against the housing market. Homeownership has historically been the primary mechanism by which middle-class families built wealth, but the math of entry has shifted dramatically. In many major cities, buying a home now requires either inherited wealth, a dual income, or taking on a debt load that would have been considered extreme by previous generations' standards. The result is that the traditional ladder, education, employment, ownership, equity, now requires more debt at every rung than it did 30 years ago. You are not climbing a ladder. You are borrowing the ladder, paying for the ladder, and hoping the ladder retains its value long enough to cover what you owe on it. Who benefits and how? This is the part that requires a clear head, because it is easy to slide into cynicism and lose the actual point. The debt system is not a coordinated conspiracy. It is an emergent structure built from thousands of individual incentives that happen to point in the same direction. Lenders benefit from long-term borrowers. Financial institutions benefit from fee income and interest spreads. Governments benefit from consumer spending that debt enables. Corporations benefit from employees who cannot easily take financial risks. No single actor designed this, but collectively, the interests of every major institution in the economy align around keeping individuals in a state of managed indebtedness. Meanwhile, the people who benefit most from the system are those with enough existing wealth to be net creditors rather than net debtors. If you own significant financial assets, Other people's debt is your income stream. Every interest payment someone makes flows to whoever holds the other side of that instrument. Wealth compounds upward. Debt service flows toward it. This creates a self-reinforcing dynamic. Those with capital accumulate more through interest. Those without capital rent access to money they need, paying a percentage for the privilege. Forever, the gap does not close over time through this mechanism. It widens. What clarity actually looks like. None of this means debt is always a mistake. That would be the wrong takeaway and a useless one. Leverage, used intelligently, can build genuine wealth. A mortgage on an appreciating asset at a reasonable rate. In a market where renting is more expensive, business debt that produces income exceeding its cost is a rational tool. Not all borrowing is equivalent, but the distinction that matters, the one the system is not particularly invested in teaching you, is the difference between debt that works for you and debt that works on you. Debt that funds an appreciating asset, produces income, or expands earning capacity can make economic sense. Debt that funds consumption carries high interest, or extends indefinitely to service itself as a transfer of your future income to someone else. That transfer is constant, quiet, and frequently invisible in the day-to-day texture of life. The practical implication is not to reject the system. That option does not meaningfully exist for most people. The implication is to understand exactly what each financial obligation is doing, not just the monthly payment, the total cost over the life of the instrument, the opportunity cost of that capital deployed elsewhere, the behavioral constraints the obligation creates. Most people making financial decisions are looking at affordability. Can I make this payment? That is the wrong question. The right question is, what does carrying this obligation cost me in total, and what does it prevent me from doing? Here is where we land. Modern economies were built to require borrowing. That is not a flaw in the design. It is the design. Consumer credit expanded not because it was good for consumers, but because it was productive for capital. Student debt grew because it was a reliable, legally protected income stream for lenders. Housing prices rose in part because cheap mortgage credit made higher prices possible, and higher prices made more credit necessary. None of it required malice. It only required that each piece be profitable to someone with influence over how it was structured. And somewhere in the middle of that structure, living quietly inside it, is most of the population. Making payments, meeting obligations, getting by. Which leaves a question worth sitting with. If the system was built around the assumption of your debt, and the institutions inside it profit from the duration and depth of that debt, and the laws governing that debt were written largely by people with financial interests in the outcome, then who exactly is this system designed to serve? And the more important question, does your current financial life reflect a choice you made or a default you inherited? That distinction is worth knowing.